The decision to visit my grandparents' village was one we made together, or at least, that's how I wanted to see it. In truth, it had been my wife's idea. She pushed for the trip with a determination that surprised me, insisting that a getaway to the countryside was exactly what we needed. I couldn't understand her eagerness. She had only been there twice before, briefly, during holidays. And yet, her enthusiasm was relentless. I hadn't seen my grandparents in years. My grandfather's health had taken a sharp decline, and now he was bedridden, his body limp and lifeless except for the occasional flicker of recognition in his eyes. He couldn't speak anymore. A stroke had stolen that from him along with any movement below his neck. I agreed to go, thinking that perhaps she was right. Maybe a change of scenery would do us good. Things between us had been tense lately, though nothing specific had caused it. A strange sense of detachment had settled between us, creeping into our conversations and curling around the edges of our shared moments. I kept telling myself it was normal, just a phase. Every relationship goes through lulls, right? We arrived mid-morning, greeted by the familiar scent of damp earth and the faint whiff of wood smoke that clung to my grandmother's shawl as she hugged us. Despite the years, her warmth was unchanged, and she welcomed my wife like family. My grandfather lay silently in his room, propped up on a worn pillow, his gaze unfocused but kind. I squeezed his hand in greeting, feeling the weight of the years and regret pressing against my chest. My wife seemed comfortable, too comfortable. She slipped easily into the rhythm of life there, as if she belonged, and I found myself feeling like the visitor instead. That first afternoon, we sat together outside on the old swing under the walnut tree, letting the lazy creak of the chains fill the silence. I watched her as she stared out at the fields, the sun catching in her hair. She looked serene, far more at ease than I had seen her in months. And then I saw him. A man I didn't recognize was walking up the path towards us. His frame was lean but muscular, his movements casual, almost too self-assured. At first, I thought he was coming to see my grandmother, perhaps a neighbor here to buy milk or eggs, as many did. But he walked straight to us, his eyes locking briefly with mine, before shifting to my wife. I tried not to let the discomfort show on my face. He introduced himself as Albert. To my growing unease, my wife seemed delighted to see him, her expression brightening in a way I hadn't witnessed in a long time. "Albert," she said warmly, like they were old friends meeting after years apart. Something about the way she greeted him tightened the knot in my stomach. She had never mentioned anyone named Albert before, and as far as I knew, she had no connections here outside of my family. She told me they had met online in some community group for travel enthusiasts. Her explanation seemed harmless enough, but it didn't sit well with me. Why hadn't she mentioned him before? The three of us talked briefly, though it was clear from the start that I wasn't really part of the conversation. They exchanged small pleasantries about life in the city and countryside, laughing easily as if I weren't sitting right beside them. I excused myself after a while, feeling like a guest at my own reunion, and went inside to help my grandmother with dinner preparations. Even my grandmother noticed something strange. She gave me a knowing look as I carried vegetables to the sink, her hands moving skillfully as she prepared soup. "He's not from around here," she said quietly, referring to Albert. "And in a village this size, we know everyone." Her words gnawed at me, but I told myself not to overthink it. My wife could have made a new friend. There was no harm in that, was there? And yet, throughout the afternoon, unease followed me like a shadow, clinging tighter with every passing hour. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and bathed the village in a dusky glow, the tension within me grew heavier. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the day felt off. Albert had left just before dinner, but the unease he stirred inside me refused to fade. I wanted to convince myself that my discomfort was nothing more than jealousy, a side effect of being married to someone as beautiful and charming as my wife. Yet that reasoning felt hollow, like an excuse to ignore the warning bells ringing in my mind. We sat with my grandmother at the dinner table, my wife slipping into easy conversation, her laughter light and untroubled. She had always been good with people, drawing them in without effort. But tonight, Something about her composure felt too perfect, like a delicate mask that concealed something. What exactly, I couldn't say. The house was quiet after dinner. My grandmother retired early to bed, leaving the two of us alone with my silent grandfather in the next room. My wife suggested we sit on the porch swing again, saying the night air felt refreshing. But I declined, offering a weak excuse that I needed to check on my grandfather instead. She didn't press the matter. She just smiled in that patient way of hers and went outside alone, humming softly as she swung back and forth in the dark. As I stood in the doorway to my grandfather's room, I watched him for a long time. His chest rose and fell with shallow, irregular breaths. His eyes flickered slightly in the dim light, as though he were trapped somewhere between sleep and waking. I wondered, not for the first time, what he thought about all day, what emotions might swirl within him while his body lay paralyzed, trapped in this broken shell. Was he frustrated? Angry? Or had he long since accepted his fate? I sat beside his bed, taking his hand in mine. His skin was cold to the touch, his fingers limp and unresponsive. The stillness of his body only amplified the noise in my head, the insecurities, the growing suspicion, the guilt gnawing at me for even doubting my wife. I wanted to let it go, but the images from the afternoon replayed over and over in my mind. Her laughter with Albert, the subtle way she leaned toward him when he spoke, the way she brightened in his presence in a way she hadn't with me for months. I closed my eyes, trying to drown the thoughts, but they crept in deeper, their claws sinking into the quiet corners of my mind. What if there was more to this? What if Albert wasn't just some casual friend she had met online? And why had she insisted on this trip so forcefully? I tried to push the thoughts away. They felt irrational, bordering on paranoid, but the doubts clung to me. When I finally left my grandfather's side and returned to the porch, she was still there, her silhouette swaying gently in the dim light cast from the kitchen window. She looked peaceful, almost lost in her thoughts. I studied her from the doorway, trying to read her body language, hoping to find some clue, some tell that would either confirm or dispel the unease lodged in my chest. But she looked exactly as she always did, relaxed, composed. A perfect picture of serenity. "Come sit with me," she said, glancing over her shoulder with a soft smile. I hesitated for a moment before joining her. The swing creaked as I sat down beside her, and we drifted in a comfortable rhythm, the cool night air brushing against our skin. "I love it here," she whispered after a while, her gaze fixed on the darkened fields beyond the garden. "It's so peaceful, so different from the city." I murmured in agreement, though my thoughts were elsewhere. I kept waiting for her to mention Albert, to explain their connection, to offer something, anything, that would put my mind at ease. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned her head against my shoulder, her hand slipping into mine. It felt familiar, comforting even, and yet in that moment, her warmth only deepened my confusion. If she was hiding something, how could she be so calm? How could she sit here beside me, as if everything was perfectly normal? Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting my insecurities cloud my judgment. It wouldn't be the first time. I had always been prone to overanalyzing, to looking for patterns that weren't there. It was one of my worst habits, one that had caused tension between us more than once. Still, as much as I wanted to believe I was imagining things, the doubts gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. I replayed every moment of the day in my mind, searching for clues, for cracks in the facade. But nothing concrete stood out. When we finally went to bed that night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as my wife slept soundly beside me. The rhythmic rise and fall of her breath should have been soothing, but instead, it left me feeling more isolated than ever. The shadows in the room seemed darker somehow, the silence heavier. I turned my thoughts over and over, examining them from every angle, trying to make sense of the disquiet that had taken root inside me. There was no proof, nothing I could point to, no evidence of betrayal beyond the lingering feeling that something was terribly wrong. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She hadn't done anything to warrant my suspicion. She had been kind, attentive even, but no matter how many times I repeated these reassurances, The nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let me rest. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My wife was still asleep, curled beneath the blankets with a peaceful expression on her face. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake her, and made my way outside. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass. I told my grandmother that I would take the cows out to pasture, offering her a day of rest. She smiled and patted me on the hand in gratitude and said that she would go to her friend's house right then, although I could see the unspoken question in her eyes. Something was bothering her too, although she did not say it out loud. As I walked the cows along the familiar path toward the grazing fields, I tried to clear my head. The countryside stretched endlessly before me, the horizon bathed in a soft orange glow as the sun crept over the hills. And yet, even out here, surrounded by nothing but the gentle sounds of nature, I couldn't escape the unease that followed me. It clung to me like a second skin, whispering doubts into the quiet spaces of my mind. When I returned home around noon, I saw Albert leaving the house. His presence was like a jolt to my system, an unwelcome reminder of everything I was trying to suppress. He smiled politely as we crossed paths, offering a friendly nod before walking down the path that led out of the village. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, a storm of emotions rising inside me. Anger, why had he been here again? And why didn't my wife mention it? When I entered the house, my wife greeted me with her usual warmth, acting as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She chattered on about the morning, talking about the weather and how my grandfather seemed more alert today, as if Albert's visit was of no significance. But when I looked at my grandfather, I saw something different. His eyes, those tired, helpless eyes, were wide with what I could only describe as fear. His body, though immobile, seemed tense, as if some terrible truth was trapped inside him, struggling to escape. That look haunted me, long after Albert had gone. And for the first time, I began to wonder if my worst fears weren't just the product of my imagination. Maybe I wasn't wrong. I couldn't shake the tension from my body. As the hours passed, I wandered aimlessly around the house, my mind clouded with questions. I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions, but each time I closed my eyes, I saw Albert's face again, too familiar, too comfortable, as if he belonged here more than I ever could. After lunch, my wife seemed relaxed, humming softly as she swept the kitchen floor. There was no guilt on her face, no sign that she was hiding anything. But that made it worse somehow. If there was something going on, how could she act so normal? I tried to keep busy, helping my grandmother with small tasks around the house, but my mind kept drifting back to the morning, to Albert walking out of the door, and the look on my grandfather's face, frozen with fear. My wife had dismissed it casually, saying the old man was startled by someone new in the house. But something about his expression haunted me. Late in the afternoon, I found myself sitting beside my grandfather again, watching him closely. His gaunt face seemed tense, his lips trembling as though trying to speak. But no words would come. They never could. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to me, wild with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "Grandpa?" I whispered, leaning closer. "What is it? What do you need?" He groaned, the sound low and guttural, trapped deep within his throat. His frustration was palpable. He moved his eyes toward the nightstand. His only way of communicating these days was with small gestures. I followed his gaze and opened a drawer, finding what I assumed he was trying to ask for, a notepad and a pen, and used but waiting, as if for just this moment. I placed the pen in his hand and held the pad steady on the bed beside him. His fingers twitched weakly, trembling with effort as he scratched the pen across the paper. It wasn't much, just crude, broken lines that barely resembled letters. But I could feel the weight of his intentions behind every stroke. Slowly, painfully, he worked to form words. It was a grueling process. I sat by his side, watching in stunned silence as he labored over each letter. At last, he dropped the pen. His hand fell limp, exhausted from the effort, but his eyes remained fixed on mine, wide and pleading. I picked up the sheet of paper, my heart pounding as I deciphered the jagged scrawl. It was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and uneven, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. For words stared back at me. Your wife is cheating. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My grandfather's message was simple, yet it carried the weight of something catastrophic, like a slow-burning fuse reaching its end. I looked at him, stunned. He blinked once, as if to confirm what he had written. There was no mistake. He had seen something I had been too blind, too trusting to notice. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind at once. How did he know? What had he witnessed? Was it Albert? It had to be. But how? And more importantly, when? My grandfather, trapped in his broken body, had been silently watching everything unfold from his bed, his helpless gaze the only witness to something unspeakable. I sat back in the chair, feeling as if the walls were closing in around me. The weight of the note in my hand was unbearable, like holding a secret so heavy it threatened to crush me. My fingers trembled as I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, my heart thundering in my chest. I wanted to storm out of the room, to confront my wife, to demand the truth. But fear held me back. Fear of what I might uncover. Fear of the conversation I wasn't ready to have. I looked at my grandfather again, and in his eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Shame. He had seen it happen. I didn't know how, but I could feel it in his gaze. He had been there, helpless, as my wife betrayed me in front of him. I could only imagine the torment of being unable to stop it, of watching everything unfold with no power to intervene, no voice to warn me. I wanted to say something to him, to thank him, to apologize for leaving him alone with her, to tell him that I understood. But no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, I stood, feeling as though the floor beneath my feet had turned to quicksand. My legs wobbled as I made my way out of the room, the folded sheet of paper burning in my pocket like a brand. In the hallway, I paused, trying to steady my breathing. My wife's voice drifted from the kitchen, light and carefree, as if everything in the world was perfectly fine. But nothing was fine. I had proof now, or at least as much proof as I could bear to hold in my hands. And yet I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to thrust the note in her face and demand the truth. But another part of me, the part that feared her answer, held me back. What if it wasn't just my imagination? What if everything I suspected was real? I leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and something worse, betrayal. I had trusted her, loved her. I had given her everything I had, and yet this. I stayed in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, listening to the clink of dishes in the kitchen, the gentle hum of my wife's voice as she sang softly to herself. How could she sound so happy, so carefree, if she had done what my grandfather claimed? I felt sick, my stomach churning with doubt and rage. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't confront her just yet. Not without more. Because if my grandfather was right, if what I feared was true, then I needed to be sure. Sure enough to tear everything apart. The next morning, I woke with the bitter taste of unease still clinging to me. My wife lay beside me, her breathing soft and steady. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I had tucked my grandfather's note beneath my pillow, its presence like a thorn pressing into the back of my mind. His words circled endlessly. Your wife is cheating. I turned my head and looked at her sleeping form, the peaceful rise and fall of her chest. How could she lie there, so serenely, while my world crumbled beneath me? A wave of nausea twisted in my gut. I needed to know the truth. Today, I would follow her. I slipped quietly from the bed, careful not to wake her, and dressed quickly. My heart hammered against my ribs, heavy with anticipation. I needed answers, and I would get them, no matter how much they hurt. I made up an excuse at breakfast, telling her I would take the cows to pasture again. My grandmother smiled gratefully, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. My wife, too, seemed unbothered, sipping her tea with the same calm demeanor she had worn since we arrived. I kissed her forehead, just a gesture, out of habit, and the touch felt hollow, foreign. I told her I'd be back around noon, but my mind was already elsewhere. I wasn't going to the pasture. I was going to find the truth. I left the house and circled back, careful to stay hidden among the hedges at the edge of the property. The old walnut tree provided enough cover to keep me concealed. From here, I could watch the house without being seen. I crouched down, forcing myself to stay still, and waited. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat a cruel reminder of the doubts I hoped were wrong. An hour passed, then two. The stillness of the countryside stretched around me, amplifying every small movement. Leaves rustling, distant birds calling. And then, just as the clock's hands inched toward 10, my wife appeared. She stepped outside, looking around briefly. Her body language shifted, relaxed but purposeful, as though she was waiting for someone. I leaned forward slightly, breath held, and watched. It didn't take long. Albert arrived not 5 minutes later, strolling up the dirt path as if he owned the place. He smiled the same confident smile that had unsettled me the first time we met. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to storm out of the bushes and confront them right there. But I needed to see more. I needed to be sure. And then it happened. My wife met him halfway down the path. He leaned in close, too close, and she let him. Their lips brushed in a kiss that was too intimate, too familiar, to be anything but what I feared. It wasn't a hesitant peck between old friends. It was deliberate, practiced, and it shattered the last sliver of hope I had been clinging to. I bit down hard on my lip, the metallic taste of blood flooding my mouth. My heart felt like it was being ripped apart, piece by piece, as I watched them stand there, lost in each other. Everything inside me screamed to run, to shout, to stop this madness. But I forced myself to stay rooted in place. Not yet. They spoke for a few moments, their voices too low for me to hear. My wife's expression softened in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her eyes sparkled with something that hadn't been there when she looked at me. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. She wasn't just cheating. She was happy, happier with him than she had ever been with me. They walked back toward the house, side by side. I gave them a few minutes, then slipped from my hiding spot, heart pounding in my ears. I crept along the side of the house, careful to stay in the shadows, until I reached the window of my grandparents' room. I pressed myself flat against the wall and listened. Inside, I could hear them talking, their voices hushed but clear enough to send ice down my spine. "Are you sure he won't be back soon?" Albert asked. His voice carried an edge of arrogance that made my skin crawl. "No," my wife whispered, her voice light with amusement. "He won't be back until noon. We have plenty of time." The words stung, twisting the knife deeper. She knew. She knew exactly when I would return, and she had planned this all along. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped toward the door, ready to burst in and catch them red-handed, ready to confront the betrayal head-on. But just as my hand reached for the doorknob, I heard something that stopped me cold. They weren't in the kitchen. They weren't in our room. They were in my grandparents' room. My breath hitched as the sound of soft laughter filtered through the door, followed by the unmistakable creak of the bed. My grandfather was in there with them, powerless, unable to move or speak, forced to witness the unthinkable. The image hit me like a physical blow. I could see it in my mind, clear as day. Albert and my wife, tangled together in front of my helpless grandfather. His terrified eyes watching as the woman I loved threw away everything we had built, right in front of him. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I stumbled back from the door, my body trembling with rage and disbelief. This was worse than anything I had imagined. Not only had she betrayed me, she had done it here in the most twisted way imaginable, forcing my grandfather to bear witness. I clenched my fists until my knuckles ached, my breath ragged and uneven. Every part of me wanted to barge in, to scream, to tear Albert apart with my bare hands. But some small voice in the back of my mind held me back. Not yet. If I acted now, it would be over too quickly. They needed to know the weight of what they had done. I forced myself to step away from the door, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. I stumbled back toward the bushes, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My vision blurred with rage, but I forced myself to stay hidden, crouched in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And then I heard the sounds from inside, soft, intimate noises that confirmed what I already knew. My hands shook as I pressed them to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. Every sound was a reminder of the betrayal unfolding just feet away from my helpless grandfather. I sat there, paralyzed by the weight of it all. This was no accident, no mistake. This was deliberate, cruel, and unforgivable. And the worst part was that they didn't care, not about me, not about the vows we had taken, and certainly not about the man lying paralyzed in that room. When Albert finally left, hours later, I watched him stroll down the path, whistling as if he didn't have a care in the world. My wife came out soon after, adjusting her clothes and smoothing her hair. She looked around briefly, then went back inside without a second glance, as if nothing had happened. I sat there in the bushes, frozen, my mind a whirlwind of emotions: rage, betrayal, sadness, and something worse, a cold, calculated resolve. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought I was oblivious. But they were wrong. I would bide my time. I would gather every piece of evidence, every fragment of truth, until I was ready to confront them. And when that moment came, I wouldn't just expose the betrayal. I would tear down everything they thought they knew. The next day, I repeated yesterday's actions. I couldn't wait any longer. The moment Albert kissed her on the path, something inside me broke. The final thread that had held back the storm inside me snapped. But it wasn't enough to watch from the sidelines. I needed to see it with my own eyes, confront the truth directly, and face the betrayal head-on. The plan I had formed last night felt distant now, overshadowed by the sheer rage burning in my chest. I had tried to hold back, but now I needed to act. There would be no more hiding in the bushes, no more waiting. This morning I told her I was going to take the cows out of pasture like yesterday. But instead of going to the field, I turned back and slipped behind the house, waiting in the shadows. I knew she expected me to return around noon. She felt safe and comfortable enough to let Albert back into her home, just like before. Only this time, I was going to catch them. Just after 10, I saw them. My wife stepped outside, scanning the empty dirt road, and smiled when Albert appeared, as if she had been waiting for him all along. They kissed again, this time longer, more intimately, and walked back inside together, hand in hand. I felt the rage bloom in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Not yet. I stayed low, creeping toward the house, my heart hammering in my chest with every step. This time I didn't need to guess what was happening. I knew. I felt it in my bones. I waited for a moment after they disappeared inside. Then I followed, moving quickly but quietly, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door creaked open under my hand, and I slipped inside, careful not to make a sound. I could hear their muffled voices from the other side of the house. They weren't in our bedroom. They were in my grandparents' room again. The same room where my grandfather lay paralyzed, forced to witness what they were doing. Every breath I took felt heavy, burning with rage. How could they do this? How could she bring him into that room, knowing my grandfather was there, watching, helpless? I pressed my ear to the door. Laughter, low voices. The bed creaked beneath their weight. It was happening just like before, only this time, I wasn't going to wait outside. I pushed the door open, slowly, and there they were, Albert and my wife, tangled together on the bed, lost in their betrayal. My grandfather's lifeless eyes stared at me from the corner, wide with the same horror I had seen the day before. For a moment, time stopped. They didn't notice me at first. I stood in the doorway, frozen, watching as everything I thought I knew crumbled before me. My wife, the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with every piece of myself. She wasn't just betraying me. She was doing it here, in the cruelest way imaginable, right in front of my grandfather's helpless gaze. And then Albert saw me. His expression changed in an instant, from smug satisfaction to stunned disbelief. What the? He started, scrambling to sit up. I lunged before he could finish. Everything inside me exploded at once. Months of suspicion, hours of doubt, and years of trust shattered in a single moment. I didn't stop to think. I didn't hold back. I threw myself at him, fists flying, blinded by rage. He tried to fight back, but I was faster, stronger, driven by something primal, something beyond reason or restraint. I hit him again and again, my knuckles splitting against his jaw, my body fueled by the need to make him feel every ounce of the pain he had caused me. "You thought you could walk into my house?" I growled, slamming him against the wall. "In front of my grandfather?" My voice cracked with fury, and I hit him again, harder this time. He grunted in pain, struggling to push me off, but I didn't let up. I grabbed him by the collar, dragging him toward the door. He wasn't getting away this time. Behind me, I heard my wife scream my name, telling me to stop, begging me to calm down. But her voice sounded distant, like an echo in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop, not now. Albert tried to shove me away, but I slammed him into the doorframe, hearing the satisfying crack of wood and bone. He needed to feel this, to understand what he had done. He twisted in my grip, managing to land a weak punch against my side. It didn't matter. The adrenaline coursing through me drowned out everything but the rage. I slammed him again, pinning him against the wall, my breath ragged and uneven. "Get out," I hissed. "And don't ever come back." Albert coughed, clutching his ribs as he stumbled toward the door. For a second, it looked like he might try to fight again, but one look at me told him better. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win. Not today. He glanced at my wife one last time, his eyes filled with confusion and panic. "You're insane," he muttered under his breath, staggering toward the front door. I followed him to the threshold, ready to throw him out if he so much as turned back. He didn't. He ran, clutching his side, disappearing down the path without another word. And then, finally, it was just me and her. I turned to face my wife. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face. But there was no guilt in her eyes, only anger. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No right," I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "You brought him here, into this house, in front of my grandfather," her face twisted in rage, as if I were the one who had betrayed her. "You were never supposed to know," she shouted, her voice cracking with frustration. "It didn't mean anything. You weren't supposed to find out." I stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity of her words. How could she say that? How could she stand there, furious that her betrayal had been exposed? Not sorry for what she had done, but angry that I had ruined her secret. I stepped closer, my voice low and cold. "It's over," I whispered. "You're leaving. Today." She glared at me, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. But she knew there was no coming back from this. "You can't just throw me out," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "This is our life, our house." "No," I said, my voice steady now. "Not anymore." I turned away from her, the weight of the morning crashing down around me. My hands trembled, blood smeared across my knuckles, but I didn't care. It was over. She stood there for a moment longer, as if expecting me to change my mind, to plead with her, to beg her to stay. But I didn't. And when she finally walked out, slamming the door behind her, I felt nothing but relief. The house fell silent. Just me, my grandfather, and the weight of everything that had happened. I knelt beside his bed, taking his cold hand in mine. His eyes, still wide with shock, softened as I gave him a nod, a silent promise that it was over. "You'll never have to see that again," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't respond. "I'm sorry I left you with them." The betrayal was behind us now, but the scars it left would never fade. I couldn't stay. The moment my wife left the house and her footsteps faded down the dirt road, the weight of everything I had witnessed, everything I had done, came crashing down on me. The rush of adrenaline was gone, leaving behind nothing but shame and regret. I thought throwing Albert out would bring some kind of relief, some closure. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. The house was unbearably quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the clock. My grandmother moved through the kitchen, keeping herself busy, though I could feel her gaze on me, sharp with unspoken questions. She knew something had happened, but I couldn't bear to explain it to her. I sat beside my grandfather's bed once more, his frail hand cold and unmoving in mine. His eyes fluttered weakly, the faintest flicker of awareness still present, but his color was off. His skin far too pale, his breathing shallow. A cold sweat clung to his brow, and his lips were tinged with a sickly blue. "Grandpa, I'm sorry," I whispered, guilt pressing down on me like a stone. I had left him trapped with them, with her, with Albert. And now, seeing him like this, so pale, so lifeless, I couldn't escape the terrible thought that I had failed him. My grandmother walked in and stopped short, her hand flying to her mouth. "He looks worse today," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He was doing better yesterday. What happened?" I couldn't meet her eyes. What could I say? That her grandson's wife had betrayed him in this very room, right in front of her paralyzed husband? That I had let it happen because I was too blind to see the truth sooner? "I think I should leave," I said quietly, barely able to find my voice. The words tasted bitter, but they were the only ones that felt true. I couldn't stay here. Not after this. Not with my grandfather's helpless stare burning a hole through me. My grandmother looked at me, stunned. "But you just got here," she said softly, the disbelief plain in her voice. "Your grandpa." I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I can't," I whispered, my voice thick with shame. How could I face him again? How could I look into his eyes, knowing he had seen everything I had been too blind to stop? My grandmother didn't argue. She just gave me a sad, knowing nod, as if she could see the storm I carried within me. There was nothing left to say. I packed my things in silence, my hands shaking as I shoved my clothes into the suitcase. The air felt heavy with regret, but I didn't stop. I couldn't breathe in this house any longer. When I left, my grandmother stood in the doorway, watching as I climbed into the car. She waved, her expression tight with worry, but I couldn't bring myself to wave back. I glanced at the house one last time, and then I drove away, the dust kicking up behind me as the village faded into the distance. The drive home felt endless, every mile dragging me deeper into a pit of despair. The betrayal, the rage, the shame, they swirled inside me, a toxic storm I couldn't escape. I had thought leaving the village would bring some relief, but it didn't. If anything, the silence of the road only made the weight of everything heavier. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I finally pulled into the driveway of my house. The lights were on. The sight jolted me out of my thoughts, a sick sense of foreboding settling deep in my gut. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I stared at the glowing windows, dread creeping over me like a second skin. She was supposed to be gone. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, slowly, I climbed out of the car and walked up to the front door. It was locked. My keys were back in the village. I had left in such a hurry that I hadn't even thought to grab them. But I knew who had them. I pressed my ear to the door, and what I heard sent a cold shiver down my spine. Laughter. Hers. And his. They were inside. My breath hitched as rage flooded my veins. She didn't even care. She had followed me back here, brought him with her, into my house. The place where we had built our life together. Without thinking, I slammed my shoulder against the door, the wood splintering beneath the force. The door gave way, crashing open, and I stumbled inside, fury burning in my chest. Albert was the first to react. He jumped up from the couch, his face twisting into a smug sneer. "You again?" he muttered, taking a step toward me. He didn't even look worried, like I was just some obstacle to brush aside. But I wasn't going to fight him this time. Not here. Not now. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and dialed. The police. Albert's smirk faltered as he realized what I was doing. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped, taking another step toward me. But I held my ground, my hand steady on the phone. "You're done," I said coldly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You're not walking away from this." Albert's expression darkened. He knew I'm in it. He lunged toward the door, but I was ready. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, holding him in place as I gave the dispatcher my address. "Send someone now," I said through clenched teeth. "I've got an intruder in my house." The minutes that followed were a blur of chaos and tension. My wife tried to intervene, shouting that it was all a misunderstanding, that Albert was just a friend. But her words meant nothing to me anymore. They were as hollow as the promises she had broken. Albert struggled against my grip, but he couldn't get away. Not this time. I held him down until the flashing lights of the police cars filled the driveway, bathing the house in blue. The officers burst through the door, and I stepped back, letting them take over. Albert was dragged away in handcuffs, shouting curses as they shoved him into the squad car. He tried to tell them I had attacked him, but the bruises on my hands were evidence enough. I told them the truth. He had been trespassing in my home. And when they asked about the bruises, I said exactly what I needed to. He attacked me first. The courtroom was quiet the day Albert was sentenced. For years. That's what they gave him. Enough to wipe the smug grin from his face. I sat there in silence, watching as they led him away in handcuffs, feeling nothing but a dull sense of satisfaction. My wife was next. I kicked her out of the house that same night. She screamed, she cried, she begged, but it didn't matter anymore. She had drained our accounts, taken everything she could, but I didn't care. The house, at least, was still mine. I sold it not long after, leaving behind everything that had tied me to her. The memories, the pain, it all stayed with the house. I needed to start over. Months passed in a haze of therapy sessions and restless nights, but slowly, very slowly, I began to rebuild. The rage that had consumed me faded, replaced by something quieter, a resolve to never let anyone take me down that path again. I still think about my grandfather sometimes. I wonder if he ever forgave me for what I let happen in that house. But whether he did or not, I knew one thing for sure. I would never let myself